Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Fuhrman. Welcome to Vox Novus, the new voice. Most of us are familiar with tales of close encounters of the third and fourth kinds, but how about some of the more unusual and highly strange encounters? Best-selling author of books on UFOs and the paranormal, Preston Dennett, joins me on Vox Novus this week to share some of the strangest encounters he's researched and investigated. Preston Dennett is the author of 30 books and 100 articles on these subjects, is a MUFON field investigator, and a frequent guest on radio and television programs, including Coast to Coast and the History Channel's UFO Hunters. His website is prestondennett.weebly.com, and he joins me this week to share his work and latest book, Not From Here, Volume 4. Please join me in welcoming Preston Dennett. Welcome, Preston.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks for having me on.
Preston, we last spoke earlier in 2022 when you brought Dolly Safran on with you to share her story that was featured in your book, Symmetry, A True UFO Adventure. That was one of the 30 books you've researched and written on UFOs and aliens and also the paranormal. How did all this get started for you?
I certainly wasn't looking for it. I was very skeptical of UFOs, paranormal, anything unexplained. But I found out that my brother had seen a UFO. Initially, I kind of just ignored it. I was a teenager when he came running into the house one day saying he'd seen a UFO. I didn't want to hear about it. But a couple of years went by, and it was November 17, 1986. I was watching the news, actually, and it featured a pilot who had seen a UFO over Alaska. It was quite an interesting sighting. It's very well known now in the UFO community. But the news report itself was very brief, kind of joking, and just briefly mentioned this pilot sighting. It interested me enough, though, to go back to my brother Mark, my older brother, and have him describe what he saw. And it turned out to be a really incredible sighting of a metallic disc, close up, very low, treetop level. He watched it with his two friends for 15 minutes, actually chased it in his car. And that got me thinking, and I wondered if there was anyone else I knew who had seen these things. And boy, did I get a shock. There was quite a few people, not only in my family, but my friends, my coworkers. So that got me started. I started picking up books. I found out there were UFO organizations. I joined those. I became a field investigator for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and started investigating my own cases and just kind of never looked back.
Now, where did you live at the time that Mark had his sighting?
This was in Southern California, outside of LA, in a little town called Topanga Canyon, which turned out to be a hot spot. I had no idea. So yeah, this was all in Southern California. And I wondered if that's why I had so many people I knew who were having sightings, because California has kind of a reputation for being new agey, I guess. But no, I started getting cases from all across the US and, for that matter, the world.
Have you personally had a UFO encounter or a paranormal experience?
Yes, actually, I've had a few paranormal experiences. I had one at age 9, and my sister will verify this, where I knew all the answers to a game show. I didn't think of it as paranormal at the time. I just thought it was strange and funny. But yeah, she was there. I knew all the answers. It was absolutely unexplainable. After that, before I got involved in the UFO field, I did see my mother's spirit after she passed away. And again, I didn't think paranormal. I just thought I was hallucinating, honestly. Though I've never taken hallucinogenics. And after I got involved in the UFO field, I'd never seen anything, but it was about 4 years in, 5 years in, that a real close-up sighting with what I would call an orb, or I don't even know what to call it, a probe, perhaps, which dropped down in front of my car. I came to a complete stop. This was a little ball of light about the size of a golf ball and just hovered right in front of my windshield as if looking at me. And this was not a reflection. This was not a firecracker. This was 2 feet away. It kind of swerved back and forth in front of my windshield and then went straight up. And that was my first sighting. That was 1992. And I ended up having like 4 sightings that year. And since then, every couple of years, I'll have a close-up sighting. Not every couple of years, but yeah, I've had about a dozen over the years.
I'm wondering if that experience you had knowing the answers to the questions at the game shows was actually a form of remote viewing.
It wouldn't surprise me. Clairvoyance, precognition, telepathy, remote viewing are all connected to a certain degree. It's all about consciousness and your ability to reach out. And yeah, I couldn't say for sure. It was definitely an odd experience because there was a lot of questions and that needed to be answered on that game show, and I just knew them all. It was I don't even know how to explain it. I've never had an experience like that before or since.
Do you ever, when you talk about clairaudience or clairvoyance, do you ever hear messages?
I have on a few occasions, not often. I do remember once I was watching a show about a medium, Teresa Caputo, the Long Island medium, which I enjoy. Anything paranormal I find very interesting. And I was sitting down and she was about to read someone, and I heard a pretty clear voice in my head say, "There is a message for you in this next reading." And I thought, I heard that. And she started to read this person, and she said, "Does the date October 13 mean anything to you?" And I started bawling because that's the day my mother died. So that was a pretty clear-cut message.
And to synchronicity.
Yeah. I mean, because I don't get messages like that very often. Occasionally, I did have one instance where I had a very strong impulse to run onto the roof of my condominium complex. At the time, I was transcribing a witness's interview. She was a contactee and was having really incredible experiences. In fact, so incredible, I was wondering if she was entirely truthful. I knew she was, but I mean, what she was saying, I had a hard time wrapping my head around. And I ran up onto the roof of my condo. I don't know why I did this. It was an irresistible impulse. And no sooner had I got up there, honest to God, this UFO appeared, a bright oval light. It was maybe 100 feet away, 50 feet up, and it blasted me with a message. I mean, I seriously got a message from it. It said, "Hi, I'll call her Wendy. That's not her real name." It said basically, "Hi, we're Wendy's ETs. You don't believe? Watch this." And this darn thing started darting around. No kidding, back and forth in sharp zigzag movements. I mean, it was wild. I was absolutely floored. I called her up. I'm like, "Oh my God, you are not going to believe what, I just saw. These guys came and verified your story."
I've had guidance experiences throughout my life, the inner voice. And in 1975, I was stationed in Seoul, Korea. I was in the Air Force at the time. And one morning, I heard a voice say, "Something's wrong with Mom. You have to call her." Now, I had not had any kind of communication or letter or any indication that anything was wrong. And so I called. And in those days, you had your regular wired phones, and you also had extension phones. And my mother and my sister picked up the phone at the same time. And I said, "Mom, what's wrong?" And my sister says, "Oh my God, how did he find out?" And it turned out that she was going in for major surgery the next day. And my immediate reaction, my guidance was to tell her that the operation would be a complete success. She'd have a complete recovery. Everything was going to be fine. Don't worry. And that was very reassuring to her. And sure enough, that's exactly what transpired. So that contact message, wherever that came from, and I don't have an attribution that I can pin it on specifically, but that information was very, very comforting to my mother. And I'm grateful for those experiences when they happened. Now, tell us about some of your books on the paranormal. Let's start with Ghosts of Greater Los Angeles and Supernatural California.
Yeah, I had gotten a multi-book contract with Schiffer Books, and these were books I was really not planning on writing, but they did specialize in ghosts, and were very interested because I had written a previous book for them, California Ghosts, and they wanted a sequel. So that's how I wrote Ghosts of Greater Los Angeles, which is based partly on some of my own personal cases and partly on some very famous hauntings, such as the Roosevelt Hotel, which I actually went down there and spoke to people. And another was the Queen Mary, very well known for being haunted. I went down there, took the ghost tour, had some experiences myself, talked to the tour guides who shared some of their experiences. So yeah, that was a fun book to write. I got to just go to various hauntings around California and experience some of them for myself. And Supernatural California was also a really fun book to write, which is kind of a picture book to a certain extent, but it covers a wide variety of paranormal subjects all across the state of California. So I got to explore everything from gravity hills. If you know what those are places where your car appears to roll uphill, to strange archaeological sites, Bigfoot, did the whole history of Bigfoot in California. Turns out California is the leading producer in the US, certainly, of Bigfoot, and just a whole bunch of stuff. UFO hotspots, hauntings, religious miracles. I mean, you name it, I covered it.
Are any movie stars haunting Hollywood or the Hollywood Walk of Fame?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a few cases of that. Gosh, I think it was. There's several famous people haunting the Roosevelt Hotel. I think Marilyn Monroe has been seen, and Montgomery Clift, and a few others. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't see any of them, but there's definitely quite a few cases of celebrity ghosts.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, you were a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network. How did you get involved in UFO research?
It was basically, again, because my brother had seen a UFO. Turned out my sister-in-law had seen UFOs and also had a face-to-face encounter with Greys. My other sister-in-law, who married my brother Mark, had encounters with blue-skinned, short humanoids when she was a little girl. And the more I started researching this, I realized it was in my family. I mean, I had a nephew who not only had seen a UFO close up, he had a humanoid, a glowing figure come into his room, which was seen by his best friend at the time. My other nephew, my sister's boy, also had a very close-up UFO that was clearly showing itself to him. So this struck home, literally, for me. And having a lot of good friends who had had encounters, including missing time, and people at work, people I'd worked with for years. So this really, I mean, I just couldn't let this subject go. I was really kind of disappointed that it wasn't getting any media coverage really at all. It was widely ridiculed, very much not accepted by the mainstream at all, certainly not back in those days. So I became obsessed. I wanted to see a UFO. I wanted to find out what's going on, and particularly the government cover-up, which is absolutely true. It's demonstrable. This is not speculation. It upset me that my own tax dollars were being used to cover this subject up and make witnesses look like fools. The government is being very disingenuous. All the governments across the world, certainly the major ones, they know it's real, and they're not saying.
And in terms of field investigation for our listeners who are not familiar with that, tell us how this works. What do? You get assigned to a case. How do you proceed?
Yeah, exactly. Well, first you have to take a test. Now they make you take classes. Back then they did not. I got to just basically take this test, which was a take-home test. So I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. Now there was no internet back in those days. There were libraries, of course, but the test was quite involved. A few hundred questions about UFO history and photography, meteorology, astronomy, these kinds of subjects. I did very well, but it was a difficult test. And so once you pass that, you get assigned a case. Generally, it's in your area, and you interview the witness, and you go through a whole vetting process, getting corroborating witnesses, finding out if there were any other sightings at the time this person had their encounter, doing a pre-interview, not recorded usually, but then a recorded interview. And yeah, I mean, I contacted the police, gave them my phone number so they could refer me cases. I had a very huge library, so I could refer to that during my research. I mean, there's a whole process you go through when investigating a case, doing a background check to the degree that you can, and going from there.
What was the strangest case you've ever investigated?
That's a difficult question. There are quite a few really odd cases. One that always comes to mind, because it is quite strange, involved a lady who was a real estate agent, but quit that and became a psychologist. I say that because she was a good witness, very lucid, very intelligent, and she had had encounters pretty much her whole life. She'd had a number of cases of missing time. As a child, once she woke up outside her home, and this little silver disc was chasing her through the field. So it was quite scary until she was struck by this beam of light, which pulled her right up into the craft. And these sort of things, waking up and seeing grays around her bed. But she had a very unusual experience in the Watchung Mountains of New Jersey. This was, I believe, in the late 60s. And she had crashed her motorcycle. This was late at night on a very remote road, no cars around, none expected to drive through. She was okay, but her motorcycle was pretty banged up. It was damaged to the degree that she could no longer start it. It had one of those old-fashioned kickstarters. And she was pretty worried about, the situation she was in, not sure what to do. And that's when these two figures just appeared. She turned around and they were there, walked right up to her. She said she was about 2 feet away from them, and they were not full-on grays. I mean, they were not human. They appeared to have, they were wearing jumpsuits. They were quite thin, short, maybe 5 feet tall, bald heads, large dark eyes, very small features, but really looked almost human, she said. So I'm guessing they were probably hybrids. At any rate, she says they walked right up to her, told her to step back, sort of motioned, and picked up her bike. And one of them looked at her, and the other bent down and started fixing her bike. No tools, just kind of took its hands and straightened out the old-fashioned Kickstarter, set the bike up, motioned her to get back on, which she did, and this bike now worked. She could start the Kickstarter. The engine roared to life. She nodded at the ETs. They nodded at her, and off she went. So yeah, they basically rescued her. And I do have a few cases like that, but that's got to be one of the strangest.
You would think that she would have started ET motorcycle repair after that experience. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, UFO AAA.
UFO AAA, that's right. We're going to be talking about your latest book, Not From Here, Volume 4. But what was your first book on UFOs, and how did this come about?
Yeah, my first book was actually called UFO Healings, and I was planning on writing an article after I had talked to this witness who described that a healing. She had been diagnosed with a cyst in her fallopian tubes. She had MRIs. She was planning on going to surgery. But the night before surgery, she had a visitation in her bedroom. This is in Southern California. And she doesn't remember much, only that they came in there. She's like, wow, this is strange. I'm about to have surgery the next day. What does this mean? And went to the doctor, to the surgeon, and had the pre-op imaging done. And they came back into her room and they said, this is very strange. You've had surgery. What hospital did you go to? And she's like, what are you talking about? They said, your cyst is gone. You've had surgery. We know you've had because there's fluid here in your fallopian tube, which is only present if someone's had surgery. Where did you go? And she played dumb. At this point, she realized what was going on. And yeah, her cyst was gone. So she told me all about this. I interviewed her. I'm like, this would be a good subject for an article, because I knew of 5-10 cases right off the bat in the UFO literature. There wasn't a lot of talk about UFO healings at that time, but there were a few famous cases, like a French doctor who had been healed of a gash on his ankle and partial paralysis, or a police officer who was struck by a beam of light, which healed this wound on his finger, and one more, a Peruvian customs official who was healed of nearsightedness, actually, and rheumatism after being struck by a beam of light. I thought this would make a great article, but after 2-3 weeks of research, I found 30 cases. I thought, wow, this is far too big for an article. Let's dig deeper. And after a year of research, year and a half, I found over 100 cases. And that became my first book, UFO Healings.
Wow. Any other case you can share with us quickly?
Oh, yeah. I would say one very interesting case involves a lady I interviewed in Norway. She contacted me because she had had grays come into her bedroom, about 6 or 8 of them. She has no history of encounters, so this was quite unusual. And she said they just started flipping her around on her bed like a rag doll, pressed this instrument against her back. She could feel energy sort of flowing through it, and filed right out through the wall. She jumped up and there was this eerie blue light outside. It winked out, but that's when she noticed that a chronic back pain from a pretty severe injury was gone. They had healed her back. I can tell you, I have about 20 cases of back healings. I now have documented 300 cases. I put out another book on this subject. So healing is a major ET agenda.
My guest is Preston Dennett. His new book, Not From Here, Volume 4. Preston, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about all this amazing work that you do.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, I do have a website. If you punch in my name on the internet, it'll take you there, I think. But the actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. You can contact me through my website, but all my books are there in excerpts. I'm all over social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. My books are available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other online retailers, and at bookstores.
And we'll be back with more of Preston after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Preston Dennett. Preston, tell us about the amazing cover and the artwork of Volume 4 of Not From Here. Just beautiful.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this series of books. This Not From Here is a whole series based on the more unusual outlying types of cases, sort of areas of UFO contact that haven't gotten a lot of attention. And my sister-in-law has done the cover for each of them, and they each feature a different type of ET. Not From 4 features a reptilian type ET. And if you see the cover, it's got these very liquidy eyes that looks almost photographically real. She's incredibly talented. I've worked with her from the very beginning, and she's been an artist her whole life. But back in 1986, when I got involved in UFO research, I approached her. I'm like, would you mind sitting down with me and the witnesses and drawing what they've seen? Because she was quite talented. And often she started working very much like a forensics police artist, doing very accurate sketches of what people have seen. And so she started illustrating quite a few of my books, most of the covers. And these images that she's putting in there are based on actual cases. I mean, these are what people have seen. So I know they're accurate because I've watched her draw them for the witnesses. And as she's finishing them up and the witnesses saying, oh, the eyes are a little bigger, or, the mouth is smaller, or what have you, and she finishes up the drawing, they will often break down into tears or just become incredibly emotional because they've got a perfect representation of their actual experience. And it allows them to show people, like, this is what I saw.
And the cover drawing and each of the chapter drawings is surrounded by an iteration of faces of various forms of ET. They're absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, I asked her to do that. Each book has a little different theme. One is little ships, one is crop circles. This latest one has ET faces. So this, I think, helps get the information out there about what people are experiencing.
Now, what were some of the events and stories shared in volumes 1 through 3 of Not From Here?
Oh, yeah, I covered a bunch of different topics. Some of them were like UFOs over graveyards, of all things. Who knew that was a thing? UFOs over prisons. UFOs are absolutely attracted to anything technological. And I found some 20 or 40 cases of UFOs over prisons, quite low, photographed, the whole deal. Just very strange aspects. The UFO Bigfoot connection, cases where people were taken on board and given drinks, something to eat or drink. So that was a chapter in one of the volumes. Phone call from an alien. As weird as it sounds, there are a bunch of cases in the literature, and I've got some myself, where people received phone calls from apparent ETs. I know how unusual that sounds, but if you go through the literature, you will see that they affect electromagnetic instruments of all kinds. Radios, stereos, TVs, car engines, you name it. So that fits in right there with that. But all kinds of weird aspects of UFO contact that you don't often hear about.
In the old days, before cell phones, when we had regular wired phones, did they call collect?
I don't have a case of that. But,
that would have been a really long distance call. That would have been a very expensive phone call, calling collect. So let's talk about volume 4. You have some fascinating stories in there. Start with the UFO car lift case.
Yeah, this interested me because when I was writing, I'd written a series of books about various states, UFOs over California, Nevada, Colorado, and so forth, New Mexico, Arizona, New York. And when I was writing UFOs over Nevada, I ran into 3 cases in a row in which people were driving along a highway, which is usually a remote highway, usually late at night, and a UFO swoops down and picks their car up off the road, carries it for anywhere from a few yards to a quarter mile, a mile, or even more in some cases, usually just a few, maybe 6 feet off the ground, 4 to 6 feet. It's very strange because UFOs do have a sort of penchant for chasing cars down the highway. But these cases went to a whole new level and were not, in most cases, involving an onboard experience where people are being, pulled up with their car, because that does happen. But no, these are cases where the UFO just comes down, lifts the car up, carries it down the road, and sets it back down. And I found after researching it about 20 cases, and some are really dramatic and so strange.
Did they have a preference for model and make?
No, because I actually did look into that. I like to investigate every aspect. Often they're little cars, but there are a few cases involving, one involves a U-Haul truck, and a couple, too, involve big rigs. There was one, actually, one of the Nevada cases, which occurred in 1999, involving a gentleman who was driving a big rig truck and pulled over because this UFO was darting around. And he stepped out of his car or his truck, and this object came right for him. And he became frightened, hopped back into his truck, and tried to drive away and realized he wasn't moving. And looking down, he saw that his truck was now 6 feet in the air, and the UFO was above him. And in his case, he wasn't carried along for any distance. He was just lifted up, and then after a few moments, set back down, and off he went on his way. So I think what's going on here is these UFO occupants are saying hello in a very dramatic way that's absolutely unmistakable. I can't figure out what the motive is other than to say, here we are.
Speaking of lifting up, you have a chapter entitled When Abductees Levitate. Are you saying that ETs are teaching people how to physically levitate?
Yes. And this was quite shocking to me because although I'd been reading the UFO books for years and these accounts were popping up, I didn't connect the dots until I started getting my own encounters. One involved a Marine officer who, as a very young kid, 5 years old, 6, had an onboard experience, was taken from his home in San Fernando, California, a little government housing project, and was set back down outside his home, went back inside, went to his room, and spontaneously levitated. This was not a UFO lifting him up on a beam of light. He was doing this himself. And it went on for a few minutes. He sat back down and ran to tell his mom, who didn't believe him, sent him outside to play with the local neighborhood kids. They were all playing hide and seek. And because he was the newcomer to the game, they designated him as the seeker. And he started counting down as everyone else hid. And when he reached the end of his countdown, he levitated up to the top of the building and he could see where everyone was hiding. This happened spontaneously. He ended up having a third episode of levitation. And I thought, wow, this is unique. But I started thinking about it. I'm like, hey, this happened to Whitley Strieber, who's very well known in this field. He wrote the book Communion about his experiences with ETs in upstate New York. He had an experience of spontaneous levitation in July of 1986 in his cabin. Just floated up to the ceiling, bounced up and down for a little while, and came back down. And that's when other cases started, coming to my mind. I know there's a very well-known case from Jacques Vallée and Aimé Michel, the French researchers, involving a medical doctor in France who in 1968 had an experience where a UFO struck him with a beam of light. He was coincidentally healed of 2 conditions, partial paralysis and a gash on his foot. But following that experience, he spontaneously levitated twice. While lying in his bed, just floated up. In fact, he had cathedral ceilings, so it was quite high up, 15 feet or so. And in one occasion, he had an actual piece of flypaper in his hand and was able to stick it on the ceiling and prove to his wife that this happened. And I started finding more cases. Stephen Greer, he's very well known for forming the group CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and for spearheading the disclosure movement. But when he was a young man, 18 years old, he had an experience outside his home in Boone, North Carolina, was set down after having an onboard experience and was walking home and started floating, levitating, and ended up having another levitation experience. And the more I dug deep into this, I kept finding more and more cases. And I'm even today got another email from someone who had this experience. They read my book and they're like, oh my God, this happened to me. I think most people don't talk about it because it's one thing to say, I've seen a UFO, I've been taken on board. People have heard of this. But saying you've physically levitated, a lot of people will roll their eyes at you and not believe you. So I think it's much more common than the dozen or so cases I was able to initially locate.
Have any of these been investigated by scientists to find out how the mechanism works?
Yes, not these particular cases, but I did write a book on human levitation some years earlier. And it has absolutely been proven in a scientific setting on at least 3 or 4 occasions. Hereward Carrington did a very ingenious experiment where he put 4 people on, or 5 people on a very large scale, which measured all their weight. And then they did the very common childhood game of finger levitation, where you do rhythmic breathing and then take the person in the center and try to lift them up on with your fingers. And he recorded a loss of weight of about, I believe it was 48 pounds or so, 46 on the first attempt. The second attempt, it was 52. The third, it was 46. He did it like 10 times and recorded a loss of weight within that range over and over again. And there was another case involving Eusapia Palladino, a medium who toured Europe throughout the late 1980s, I believe it was, or 1880s to, I'd have to look up the exact date, but she toured Europe and visited many scientists who were quite well known, had won Nobel Prizes and had all kinds of patents, and convinced them that she was able to levitate. And just one final case comes from Brazil's most famous medium, who was able to convince a group of scientists that he levitated because he did it right in front of them. So yeah, this has been proven in a laboratory setting several times, and is very well verified.
I'm wondering if this might have something to do with some type of field reversing gravity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a lot to learn about the human body. I know Nina Kulagina was a Russian psychic who was able to do telekinesis, and they were able to measure a magnetic field coming out of her hands. And contactees often will report that when they walk by TVs or radios, they will fuzz up. They have a very expensive light bulb budget because they're constantly blowing out light bulbs.
Yeah.
The gentleman I interviewed who had a levitation experience as a child, a Marine officer, was also a welder in a factory and kept blowing out this very expensive welding machine. No one else would, just him. His superiors actually called him in and demanded that he undergo a physical examination with the company doctor to figure out what was going on. They couldn't figure it out. But I can tell you, I've interviewed a lot of people who've had this. One lady, following her encounter, went to work. She blew out her computer, called the IT guy to fix it, went to the copier, blew that out, called him again, like, fix the copier after you're done with my computer, and then went to the fax machine and blew that out. And they're like, stay off machines. What are you doing to them? This is very common among contactees.
Fascinating. Are there times of the year or specific days when UFO sightings and activity are greater than other times? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's very well known among UFO researchers that summer is much more likely time to see a UFO. And I've always kind of thought, well, it's warm, people are outside at night, and this is probably the reason. So I started, hearing about cases. July, it turns out, is the most common month. And I started getting cases of people seeing UFOs on the 4th of July, which I dismissed because I can't think of a worse day to see a UFO other than perhaps April 1st, which is, April Fool's Day. But if you see a UFO on July 4th, my immediate thought is you're seeing fireworks. But I kept hearing cases, and some of these were clearly not fireworks. I mean, these were metallic craft with portholes or objects that would dart around at right angles and remain in the sky for a good portion of time. And after getting more of these cases and hearing a little bit of buzz about this on the internet, I decided I would just look at MUFON, their database, the Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, because they have big databases of thousands upon thousands of accounts. And boy, did I get a huge shock. Not only is July the most common month to see a UFO, July 1st, or 4th, rather, Independence Day, is the most common day to see a UFO by far. They receive an average of maybe 10 to 20 sightings on any given day. 5 on some days, maybe a little bit more on others. But on July 4th, almost without exception, it's 50, it's 100 accounts. So I started looking into this. And mind you, this was thousands upon thousands of cases to review. And a lot of them, I thought, these sound like party lanterns, sky lanterns, which are sent aloft with a little candle and a paper balloon. But the thing is, these can last only 15 minutes. Then they burn out. They can reach a height of about 4,000 feet. And from a distance, if you don't know what it is, it can be quite dramatic. I've seen them myself. But a lot of these objects were clearly not party lanterns because they were darting around at very high speeds, would stay aloft for well over 15 minutes. We're talking an hour. And again, many of them were solid craft. And so this is absolutely a thing. Most of these witnesses feel like these UFOs are coming down to watch the fireworks show. Honestly, I think something else is going on here too. There are millions of people outside at night on the 4th of July. Millions. And this is a wonderful opportunity for ETs to fulfill one of their main agendas, which is to announce their presence. And I think that's what's going on here, because on many of these cases, they not only show themselves, but will put on a show themselves. That's more dramatic than the fireworks show. I mean, one case that really I thought was kind of touching involved a mother and son who were in Glen, Mississippi. This was 1988. This happens every single year. But her son was shooting off fireworks. Suddenly, multiple triangular-shaped objects swooped down. There was a half dozen of them, quite large, about the size of a pickup, they said, and put on a show for like a half hour, darting around, swooping up and down, dancing around in the sky. Probably would have stayed longer, but military jets came and chased them away. So yeah, this is absolutely a thing. I think we should call these, they're simple sightings, but honestly, these are CE5s. By that, I mean close encounters of the fifth kind, or human-initiated encounters. So this is a great method to do live field work with UFOs.
My guest is Preston Dennett. His new book, Not From Here, Volume 4. We'll be back with more of Preston after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Preston Dennett. His new book, Not From Here, Volume 4. Preston, are there any cases of people physically fighting with ETs?
Yes, there are. In fact, I mentioned Lady Wendy, who's, basically, that's when I ran to the roof of my condo and the ETs came down and said, her case is real. I mean, gave me that message. And the reason I was doubting her case is because she described this very strange event, which I hadn't heard before. She had Greys come down, surround her bed. She was very frightened. In a panic, she jumped up and kicked one of them in the neck, snapped its neck. She felt quite bad. She later realized they weren't trying to hurt her, but reacted violently in a sort of fight or flight reaction. And she thinks she may have actually killed one of these things. Hard to say, but it did stop the experience. And that was very interesting to me because I had only heard of one other case that was at all like that. And that involved Travis Walton, actually. A very famous case, November 3rd, 1975. I won't get into it. It's very well known. But once he was on board, he panicked too and reached out and punched one of these gray ETs. And then I started running into other cases. I interviewed this gentleman from England who does not want his name used. He's told no one except his wife and best friend about his constant visitations and being taken on board. And he says he came down out of his bedroom once to go to the bathroom, which is unfortunately on the far side of the house, went down the stairs and saw a gray in the living room. Now, this had happened before, and he blanked out and woke up in bed. This time he reacted. He ran right up to it and grabbed it around the neck and started choking it. He's not happy about his encounters. So he said the skin was kind of cold and firm and leathery. And this gray started speaking in his mind, shouting, "Let go, let go, let go." And the next thing, its arms were windmilling around, and suddenly something came from behind him and knocked him out, and he woke up back in bed. Mm. And that was the first time. You can kind of feel them coming when, someone has an encounter. Often they'll know, they'll get a feeling, a little bit of precognition. And he woke up one evening. He knew they were in the room. He could feel their presence. So he waited until they approached the bed. Then he whipped off his covers. And sure enough, there was a little gray. He reached back and punched this thing in the face. Ooh. And he says, it was not happy. So they look really cute and harmless and innocent when they're just standing right there. They're short little things. But he says as soon as he hit it, its mouth opened up real wide. It showed a bunch of sharp, pointed teeth. It hissed at him. It was not happy. And he said punching it was like punching a beanbag. His fist just sunk right into it. So I have a number of cases like this. And after putting out this book, people are contacting me. So I'm absolutely getting more cases of this. Another guy interviewed in Louisiana, same experience. He woke up on board a UFO and just panicked, leapt off the table and started socking them one after another. They physically surrounded him and eventually were able to render him unable to move.
We're all familiar with UFOs and crop circles, but you shared that UFOs and ETs have an interest in fertilizer. Please explain.
Yes, this was so bizarre and something I've wanted to explore for a while because of the Betty and Barney Hill case, which is very well known. It occurred in 1961. They had a missing time encounter in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. But what a lot of people don't know is about the fertilizer connection. And this is so strange because when their case was first revealed, two scientists came up to them, and this is Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson. And they were very much mainstream scientists and started asking them all these weird questions. At the time, Betty and Barney Hill weren't aware that they had been taken on board. They knew something had happened that was more than a sighting because, of course, Barney's shoes were scuffed up and Betty had her dress torn. They had weird marks on their car. these two researchers asked them a very weird question. They said, do you have any fertilizer in your car at the time of your encounter? And they thought that was pretty much irrelevant. And they said, no, what are you talking about? But that's when they realized, oh, in fact, they did. They had a bag of fertilizer in the trunk. And these two scientists told them that they had interviewed other people who had had missing time encounters who were involved in the nitrates industry or had some connection to fertilizer. And that's where it rested for years. These two investigators never talked more about this connection. And while this was raised in the Betty and Barney Hill case, and still is to this day, there was no real research on it. And I decided to peruse the literature and see if I could find any other cases, because I knew of one that was quite well known, and that involved a soldier by the name of Gary T. Wilcox, a former soldier, military officer who had become a dairy farmer in upstate New York. And he had a very unusual encounter on April 24th, 1964, where a UFO landed in his fields. And long story short, I mean, he thought it was a refrigerator that had been dumped on his land, or perhaps an airplane engine. But as he approached this object, he saw it was a saucer. It was floating 4 feet above the ground. But is this military? What is this? But two humanoids came out. They were dressed from head to toe in a uniform, even covering their faces, but spoke to him for over an hour. Perfect, flawless English, no accent, and gave him all kinds of information. And he refused to disclose a lot of what they said. He said it was very much personal. But he was later investigated by the military and UFO researchers. His neighbors vouched for his integrity. But he said that these ETs started asking him about fertilizer. Like, why is he fertilizing his fields? What is this? And he explained the purpose of fertilizer, what it was, and how it worked. And they said, could we have a bag? And he said, yes, and gave them an 80-pound bag of fertilizer. By the time he returned to give them this bag, they were gone. So he set it down, and it disappeared the next day. So presumably they got it.
Wow.
But I found other cases where there is a connection. They're hovering over fertilizer plants or investigating areas where fertilizer is being held.
Interesting. What would you offer to those who have UFO or ET encounters?
What would I offer to them? I would say, realize you are not alone. Don't feel alone with this. This is far more common than people realize. I would suggest that they write it down, because generally speaking, if someone has a close encounter, the closer it is, the more likely it is you're going to have a repeat experience. And there are some memory problems involved with close encounters. People will have missing time or completely forget even simple sightings. So write it down. If you see a UFO, first thing you should do is get another witness, because that can turn a single, insignificant case into a widespread sighting and a very well verified case. Don't be afraid. They're not here to hurt you. That is not their agenda. ET agenda is basically to heal, to wake people up to their presence, to remind us who we are as human beings with our unlimited potential to do healings and levitation and other psychic abilities. This is absolutely a major ET agenda. As a rule, contactees experience a wide variety of paranormal events and are profoundly psychic, particularly after their experience. So it's spiritually transformative. They really want people to wake up to our own abilities. And when someone's taken on board, yeah, it can be scary being physically examined. This is usually a healing event, whether people realize this or not. But they will also give you messages. And this is, again, why I don't think we have to be frightened, because these messages are very much the same, very consistent, and it's usually warnings against nuclear proliferation, against our warlike ways, this sort of thing, against greed and corruption, pollution. So I think this is good news for us, They are not here to hurt us or scare us or take over. They've been around for millennia. They consider us, brothers, sisters. So absolutely don't be frightened.
His latest book, Not From Here, Volume 4. Preston Dennett, please tell our listeners one more time where they can get your books and find out more about you and this amazing work.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just go to my website, prestondennett.weebly.com. You can contact me if you've got a story to share or a question or a comment. I always love hearing from people. I've got a YouTube channel, which is growing quickly. So if you're not the kind of person who likes to sit down and read, I've got, podcasts or, little presentations of my research. And yeah, I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. You can find my books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other online retailers. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on your show, Victor. I think this is an important subject. People need to know UFOs are real. And the day is coming, mark my words, when this will go full on mainstream and it won't be a mystery anymore.
Absolutely. Preston, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your work on this fascinating subject.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Vox Novus. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.